Hello and welcome. Today is August the 31st, and today we are going to discuss the Age of Faith, the Crusades, and hopefully we will just broach into the era of the Renaissance, which is where we need to go. Um, Hopefully you've taken this time and you've pulled up your study guide, the one that I have here in front of me and you. And you should be on C, which is at the very top up there, talking about the Age of Faith. Ooh, that's too big. How's that? Yes. And so I actually spent about 15 minutes talking to the fifth period AP Euro guys about the Age of Faith. If I didn't, and I think I did breach the subject in yesterday's 48-minute lecture. The Age of Faith, once again, is an era that encompasses most of the Middle Ages. And it is a period of time in Western European history when the strongest entity, the strongest institution, most powerful and the richest institution was not a government at all, but it was the Roman Catholic Church. What had happened to governments after the fall of the Roman Empire, after the breakup of Charlemagne's Frankish Empire, was that Europe became a patchwork quilt of hundreds, if not thousands, of small, semi-independent, feudal states, each state warring with each other to gain territory, to supply themselves with resources. If you've noticed on your assignment today, I supplemented in there a section from the book A World Lit Only by Fire, where it talks about how it was very common for farmers to have 4 years of productivity and 1 year of where everything fails. You have to remember that the farming technology that they used during that time really had not improved any since the Stone Age. And with the population of Europe continuing to grow, the human population, starvation was a thing. And so a year's failed crop meant people died. And excuse me, diets were unbalanced, obviously. When there was food, you ate food. Didn't matter what it was. Fruits and vegetables might be available in the summer and fall. After that, your diet got pretty starchy if you were lucky. And I'm supposed to be talking about the Age of Faith, right? Well, in the midst of all this misery is the Roman Catholic Church, is this institution that says, hey, we have a way for you to one day get out of this. And that is, after you die, there is heaven. And, oh yes, but we hold the keys to heaven. And because of that, the Roman Catholic Church could compel people to tithe, pay 10% of their income, that means everybody paying 10% of their income to the Roman Catholic Church. It got put into the offering plate, and then, of course, the local priesthood took their share out of it, and then the rest was sent on to Rome. And, of course, Rome became a very rich city, and the Pope became a very rich and powerful man. And, yeah, this was the Age of Faith. And if I did not mention it before, please scratch this down. In the Middle Ages, at the height of the height of the era of the Age of Faith, The Roman Catholic Church owned outright one third of all property, all land in Europe, and it was good property too. But I mean, it wasn't like they owned a country. It was like they owned bits and pieces of countries everywhere, properties everywhere. Now you're asking, how did the church acquire that territory? Well, once again, that you go back to Age of Faith. What did the church have that everybody wanted? Answer: keys to heaven. And you say, well, the church still has the keys to heaven, doesn't it? Well, yes, I guess, but today there are more alternatives, obviously, meaning non-Catholic faiths. And also, to be real honest, life here on earth, it has gotten better. I mean, if you read anything in that world lit only by fire thing, yeah. I mean, and I don't want to talk too much about it, but imagine living in such a place that, after the sun goes down, you better be in a house because something can happen to you. I mean, and I'm not just talking about getting mugged or anything like that. I'm talking about when the Roman Empire fell apart, wild animals, packs of wolves. And while there's never been one instance in North America of a wolf attacking a human being, do you know that? In Europe, wolves preyed upon human beings until they were hunted out of existence. Wolves, wild boars, and other such creatures that preyed on human beings. It was not safe. And it was not safe, for example, just to walk around, because remember, there was no such thing as street lights. The only light to the street, even if you lived in a village, the only light for the street came through cracks or windows openings in the houses. And those windows, remember, were either lit by candlelight, lamplight, maybe an open hearth, and that light, whatever it was, might find its way out onto the street if you were out there. And so, yeah. So I got way off the subject again, didn't I, Mr. White? The point of the matter was, you wouldn't want to live there. The point of the matter is, all these things they tell you or taught you, or you've been led to believe by watching too many bad movies. Knights and knighthood is a myth. Oh yeah, there were knights, but the idea that these knights were somehow noble creatures who, fought for good people, defended the weak. Knights were soldiers. I mean, it's not like you can crush somebody's skull in with a mace on Monday and turn around and give out candy to children on Tuesday. The two don't go together. If you are a trained killer, yeah, it's but anyway. So yeah, the Age of Faith, the church was the most powerful institution, the richest institution. We'll talk more about this later. Now let's talk about the Crusades. The Crusades were an instance when the church flexed that power. Yeah. Now, of course, most of you may have heard of the Crusades before, may have read about them in your elementary history books. The Crusades were when the Christians went to the Holy Land to try and take the Holy Land away from the Muslims, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, well, maybe. Actually, I mean, and I don't want to cast too many stones at our neighbors up in Erlanger who go to St. Henry High School, or the brave, mighty men of Moeller. If I was a high school, I don't know that I would want my emblem to be the Crusader. And in a minute, you'll know why. So here's what basically happened. In the Holy Land, and I should have pulled up a map, but yeah, Israel, Jerusalem, Palestine. Basically, if you've gone to church, Sunday school, what they talk about. The area they talk about where, Moses led the children of Israel, where David killed Goliath, where the prophets lived, where Jesus had his years of ministry, and all those things. That part of the world. Well, after the diaspora, which is something we'll talk about later when we talk about Jews. Yes, the diaspora. After the diaspora of 70 AD, it's not like the city of Jerusalem and town of Bethlehem and the area of Palestine put up a big vacancy sign and nobody moved in. Actually, quite the contrary. Jerusalem became inhabited first by Arab Muslims and then later on by Turks, Seljuk Turks. Remember, we'll learn about two kinds of Turks. There was first the Seljuk Turks, and then there were the Ottoman Turks. But here's the thing. The Turks, unlike the Arabs before them, had begun to hassle Christian pilgrims. In other words, during the age of faith, a significant number of people of faith, like they do today still, wanted to go to Jerusalem and Israel to stand in the Garden of Gethsemane, to walk where Jesus walked, to get baptized in the River Jordan, a million things like that. Well, the Turks, who were Muslim, not that that's a crime. Oh, trust me, I didn't say that. But the Turks began hassling some of these groups. And hassling, I have no idea exactly what that means. It might have meant charging them too much to stay in the inn, or it might have been actually physically assaulting them or something of that nature. Because here's the thing. The city of Jerusalem is the most holy city of Christianity, yes, but also of Judaism. It's the city of David, yes. But here's what you may not know. The city of Jerusalem is the third most holy city in Islam. Yes. There are three holy cities in Islam. Mecca, the birthplace of Muhammad; Medina, where Muhammad fled to when the people of Mecca tried to kill him; and then Jerusalem, where, according to the Quran, Muhammad went there and died there. And when he died, he rode off on a white horse into heaven. And there's a giant mosque there. And so the city of Jerusalem has tremendous attraction to three of the great faiths of the world. Yeah, I mean, think about it. Christianity is 25%, Islam is 20%. Judaism, which is not an evangelical religion, it does not seek to attract other people who are not Jewish. 0.8% of the population of the world. But anyway, and so the point of the matter is there was conflict between the Christian pilgrims who wanted to visit these places and the new rulers, the Seljuk Turks. And they began to complain about it. And also the Turks, the Seljuk Turks were also harassing the city of Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire. Yeah, the Turks had long wanted to get their mitts on the city of Constantinople and were continually assaulting the Byzantine Empire during this time. And so the Byzantines appealed to the Roman Catholic Church for help. And by the way, see, one thing I didn't talk about, the Byzantine Empire was no longer Roman Catholic. Yes, the Byzantine Empire was no longer Roman Catholic. I talked about the Byzantine Empire yesterday. The Byzantine Empire was no longer Roman Catholic. In fact, in the 10th century AD, the Christians in the Byzantine Empire and the Christians in Western Europe, the Roman Catholic Church, had a falling out, a disagreement, and so the Pope Leo, I think it's Leo the Ninth, and the Patriarch of the Christian Church, the Roman Catholic Church in Constantinople, had a fight, argument, and they excommunicated each other. That's another word, excommunicated. They kicked each other out of the church. And so, in the Byzantine Empire, there was the Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox Church, and you need to know that. You need to know that that in Eastern Europe, the largest Christian religion was and is Eastern Orthodox, or also called Greek Orthodox. In Western Europe, it's the Roman Catholic Church. Well, anyway, so the Christian ministry, the Christian Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the Byzantine Empire appealed to the Roman Catholic Church, said, "Hey, come on, God, let's forget our differences. We're both Christians, and we're being harassed by these Turks. And if they conquer us, then guess who's next?" And so the Pope at the time, now you need to jot this down, the Pope at the time was a guy by the name of Urban, as in Keith Urban, as in city. Urban, Urban, Urban the Second. Pope Urban II sees opportunity. And so Pope Urban II calls together all the lords and dukes and warlords and anybody of rank, any of the nobility, together at the Council of Claremont, and I think the year is 1095 AD, I believe. Claremont is a town in eastern France, and he arranges all of them to come there. And that took quite a bit of doing, because in addition to the situation in Jerusalem, and in addition to the appeal from the Byzantine Church, the Roman Catholic Church had its own problems. And here was the problem. Yes, the Roman Catholic Church was the most powerful entity in all of Western Europe. But there was one thing it could not control, and that was this. You see, when the Roman Empire fell and the Frankish Empire broke up later on, it seemed that these little warlords that Europe had broken off into, it seemed that they never, ever, ever got tired of killing each other. No, I mean, why do you think they call it feudalism or the feudal age? I mean, during the Middle Ages, Europe basically was a bloody battleground. One feudal lord fighting another feudal lord over a bit of territory, or who ruled who, or who should be the rightful ruler of who, etc., etc., etc. And so, in the Roman Catholic Church, as powerful as they were, they couldn't really do anything about it. They could not get these guys to stop fighting each other. I mean, they were relentless. But the Roman Catholic Church will use a ploy that leaders and politicians have used many times before them, and of course, many times since then to this very day. And the ploy is this. So you're in a group of people, and two of the people in your group hate each other. They're fighting each other. How do you get them to stop fighting each other? Especially since the fighting that we're talking about here in Europe was quite violent. Lots of innocents were being slaughtered, and they would appeal to the Roman Catholic Church for help. And the church is like, oh, man. And so how do you get two people who are fighting to quit fighting each other? Answer, you give them a common enemy, someone else that they can join together and fight. They have common ground, they're together again, they quit fighting each other. And so Pope Urban II called together all these warlords who have been fighting each other and said, okay, you guys chill for a minute. I want to talk to you. It's a matter of great urgency. And so Pope Urban II stands in front of this multitude of these hundreds, thousands of warlords and talks about how these infidel Muslims had invaded the Holy Land, how their unclean feet were walking where Jesus walked, and those kind of things. And he said that God compels us to go and free the Holy Land and cleanse it of these infidels. And he's finished with the word, God wills it. And he must have been pretty persuasive, because the warlords, that became the battle cry. God wills it. So, thus begins the Crusades. There were 4 official crusades. Okay? The most successful of the Crusades was militarily. In other words, the First Crusade was able to go to Jerusalem, knock down the walls. And by the way, when they did, the First Crusaders went to Jerusalem, they cleansed the city. You say, well, what does that mean? It means they killed every man, woman, and child, Jew, Christian, and Muslim, who inhabited the city of Jerusalem. Yeah. They cleansed the city. But anyway, the first crusade, though, was the most successful of the 4. In the end, they all turn out losers. Now, here's the thing, and you do need to write this down as well. To get these guys, these knights, these lords, to go thousands of miles, and remember, in a day when they didn't have trains or planes or fast, they had to walk, or at great expense, to risk their own lives, because lots of them died too. I mean, it wasn't like these Muslims going, oh, you want our land? Sure, you can have it. Sorry. And to get them to do that, the church had to offer them a carrot. And actually, the church offered them 3 carrots. And you're writing, how did the church persuade these knights to travel thousands of miles at great risk to their own lives, at great cost, financial and personal, to go and make war on the Muslims? The church promised them 3 things. Thing number 1, and you're writing, a fief. F-I-E-F, fief, in the Holy Land, in Palestine. You say, well, what's a fief? Stop, thief. No. A fief is a medieval term. It's a medieval term. And what it is, when in the Middle Ages, a servant was very faithful and served his master well, the master, the Lord, would give him a piece of property, land. And that land was called a fief. Of course, the church kind of glazed over the fact that, oh yeah, to take this land, you're probably going to have to kill whoever's living there. You know what I'm saying? I mean, if you can get them to go nicely by asking, I'm sure that'd be fine too, but you'll probably have to kill them, which they did. 2, the church promised that all crusaders forgiveness of all sins. And trust me, the crusaders committed some serious sins when they were there. With that red cross representing the blood of Christ on their chests, cross on their shields that they all wore, yelling, God wills it, the crusaders swept down not just Jerusalem, but the other cities of Palestine, cleansing the cities. There were incidents where the crusaders would besiege, that means to surround a city. And to persuade the inhabitants to surrender, they would capture children and put those children on spits. That means they would make a fire and then, like a barbecue spit, and roast the children slowly on the spit. Or they would, the Crusaders took dogs, war dogs, big dogs, German Shepherds, Doberman Pinschers, Mastiffs, etc., and they had trained them to kill, and they would set them upon children in the sight of the city walls. Yeah, they committed sins, and murder, torture, and rape of women during this period of time. And the church promised them forgiveness of all those sins that they were going to commit. Finally, the third thing was the church promised all the Crusaders, if they went, forgiveness of debt.
Good afternoon. Just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for such a wonderful week. I hope everyone has a great weekend. Take some time to relax. Thank you for all your work, and we will see you Monday. Thank you very much.
Now, while you're writing that down, forgiveness of debt, you might be asking, this debt that these Crusaders incurred, church going to pay it? No. Well, the Muslims going to pay it? I don't think so. They pay it from the booty and treasure they get from there? Nope. No. It just means that whatever debt you incurred, you don't have to pay it. Now, see, here's the genius part. This is genius stroke. How much money, think about it, how much this plan the church came up with that solves their problem of, freeing the Holy Land, that gets the Byzantines off their back, they help the Byzantines, that makes all these European warlords stop fighting each other. How much money did it cost the Roman Catholic Church? That's the best part. Bupkis. Nothing. Yeah, nothing. And so, genius to an extent. And so, the church launched crusades, and like I said, there were 4 official crusades. But see, that's interesting because there were 2 unofficial crusades. And you're writing, the first unofficial crusade was called the Peasants, Peasant, the Peasants' Crusade. Peasants were, of course, people who weren't lords, weren't nobility, weren't members of the clergy. And it was led by this one dude. He was a monk. A monk is a non-ordained minister of the Roman Catholic Church. And this monk's name was Peter the Hermit. Yeah, Peter the Hermit. You know what a hermit is, right? A hermit is a person who stays by themselves. Well, this guy, Peter the Hermit, gets to thinking, and he says, you know what? Why should only the nobility, why should only the knights have the honor and glory of doing God's will? Why can't the rest of us do it? So this guy, Peter the Hermit, starts walking around. He was from southern Germany. Starts walking around and preaching and saying, I'm going to the Holy Land and God is with me and we're going to cleanse the Holy Land of those infidels. We're going to do the work of God. And peasants began to hear this. And think about their lives. These peasants, and we'll talk about more about what peasants had to do. If you were a peasant, you had to work 3 to 4 days per week, not on your stuff, but on the Lord's stuff. And their lives were dirty and boring. And a lot of them just said, yeah, sure. And they put their axe or their hoe or their pitchfork on their shoulder and went off following Peter the Hermit. And so, yeah, they start walking across Europe. Here's the thing, though. The problem was, from Central Europe to the Holy Land is about 2,500 miles overland. They needed to pack a lunch that they might not have thought about. But Peter the Hermit said, hey, God will provide. And so the problem was, God providing often meant that as they traveled through the countryside and walked by farms and things of this nature, that they said, of course, you farmers will give us your food, give us your pigs, give us your cattle, so because we need bacon. And of course, the farmers didn't want to cooperate, and if they didn't, you're not doing the will of God. You're against God, and they'd kill them too. There was one particular horrible event that when they passed through what is now Hungary in Central Europe, they came upon a large population of Jews, and they began to say, why do we have to walk all the way to the Holy Land to find infidels? Look, we got Jews right here. And about 4,000 Jews were slaughtered in central Hungary alone. Now, eventually, believe it or not, this pack of wandering vagabonds eventually made it to the borders of the Turkish Empire, Seljuk Empire, and ran into a real army. And you can only imagine what happened. These traveling bozos with their pitchforks and their axes and whatever, coming up against a real army of Saracens. Yeah, it wasn't pretty. And thus was the Peasants' Crusade. And that was not the most pathetic occurrence. Remember, this is the age of faith. After the Crusades began, a young man in northern Italy, his name was Stephen of Cloy, Cloye. Back then people didn't have second names. They were named often where they were from. And this guy was Stephen of Cloy. In fact, Leonardo da Vinci means Leonardo from the town of Vinci. Most Dutch names, Van der something, Van Maitre, for example, means that they're from Maitre, or and it really de Medici of. So anyway, Stephen of Cloy one day gets a vision, and in this vision, an angel came to him and told him. And Stephen of Cloy, by the way, he was a kid. He was like 14 years old. I don't know, maybe 13. But he was a kid. And he had a vision, and an angel of the Lord came to him and said that the Muslims would never fight an army of children. And so he begins to make his way through Italy. He's going to go to Naples because there's a seaport there. And he's preaching, and children, they start following. They're going to go, and these children are going to go fight the Muslims and take the Holy Land. And they make their way down to Naples. And by this time, Stephen of Cloy has a throng of several thousand children following him. And they were able to collect some money. And when they got there, they were able to rent a ship in the harbor. The problem was the people who had sold them the ship forgot to tell them that the ship was not seaworthy. It got out into the middle of the harbor and sank. All hands on board, including Stephen of Cloy, did not escape. The rest of the children who weren't fortunate enough to get on that ship were snatched up by merchants in Naples And then here's the ironic part: they were sold as slaves to the very Muslims they were going to go fight. And that was the end of the Children's Crusade. Interesting stuff. However, I mean, this is me rambling. Little side note, little side note. Um, Perhaps you have heard of something called the Pied Piper. Anyone? Pied Piper? Yeah, the Pied Piper is a fairy tale. And I wish you were here because I know somebody's heard of the Pied Piper. I know the Pied Piper. Pied Piper is a story where, there's this town that's overrun with rats and mice. I mean, overrun with them. And they can't do anything about it. The rats are everywhere, the mice are everywhere, and it's a nuisance. And one day, this dude walks into the town and says, "Hey, I can solve your rat problem, mice problem for you." And they said, "Oh man, anything, if you can do it, buddy." And so they agreed upon a price. And so the guy reaches into his bag, pulls out a flute, and starts walking up and down the streets of the town, playing his flute. And suddenly, all these rats and mice start coming out of the houses and start following this guy. And, he goes all through the streets, all the way through the village. And then when he goes to the last street, he then exits the town and makes his way down to the river, stands there playing his flute, and the rats and mice run into the river and drown. Which is, that's a lie, because if you know anything about rats and mice, excellent swimmers. Not lying. So, the Pied Piper, as he was called, after the last mouse went swimming, turns around, walks back up, and says, "Hey, how about my pay?" And they said, "For what?" They stiffed him. And he said, "All right." Reaches into his bag again, and now begins walking through the same streets again, playing a different tune on his flute. Only this time, all the children in the houses began following this guy. They could not be restrained. And they followed him, and they went right out of the town. And they were never seen again. And that story probably had its historical beginning with the Children's Crusade, the Crusades. So, what happened with the Crusades? The Crusades span about 200 years, each one being less successful than the next, and ending in defeat and failure. And see, this was something that Urban II and the planners of the Crusades had not foreseen, because eventually people began saying, these Crusades, they're not a winning proposition here. I'm losing men and material and money, and we're getting our heads handed to us by first the Seljuks and then the Ottoman Turks. And whose idea was this anyway? Oh yeah, the Roman Catholic Church. And that's important. That's important because the Crusades discredited, for the first time, the church had this idea that really blew up in their faces. And yeah, that was a major downer. And it made the church look bad. It was a crack. It was a chink in the armor of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, come on. The church is supposed to be always right. The church is supposed to protect us. And when the church comes and says, "Let's go on a crusade for God," and it blows up in our face, maybe the church doesn't have all the answers. Which leads us to the Black Plague, or the bubonic plague of 1347. The plague, which actually there was an outbreak on the West Coast, not an outbreak, but a person that came down with it. The Black Plague is a disease for which they still to this day really have no cure for. It is a horrific disease. It is easily spread, and it causes agonizing death. The infection basically causes a person, his lymph nodes blow up, his skin breaks out in boils colored black, and within 2 or 3 days, the person is done. And the most frightening thing, it spreads really rapidly. The Black Plague came to Europe on board of a ship in Italy. As you know, rats from that ship then hopped off the boat, went into, and I think it was Venice, went into Venice, and the fleas from those rats infected other fleas that then made their way to human beings. Fact of the matter is, fun fact, well, maybe not so fun for them, I'm sure that everybody right by now is familiar with the word quarantine. Yeah? Quarantine? You might have heard it once or twice. The word quarantine actually comes from the Italian word quarantina. After the plague got started, and they figured out that they traced the source of it back to incoming ships. And so what the city government of Venice did was that it made a law that said that any ship coming into the harbor had to set in the harbor for 40 days and basically sit out there, and they would wait to see if the sailors and whoever's on that ship survived. In fact, and so the Italian word for 40 is quarantina. Yeah, quarantine. But anyway, so the Black Plague makes its way through Europe, and the long and short story of it is the Black Plague of 1347. That's the big one. There were several plagues that came prior to 1347, after 1347. For example, the plague hit the Byzantine Empire of the Emperor Justinian, killed his beloved wife Theodora, and it almost killed him. In fact, it affected his mind. He was mentally unstable for the rest of his life. But yeah, there have been plagues before and after, but none like this one. This plague killed, and I've seen estimates. They didn't keep records. They didn't keep good records. This plague killed from anywhere from 50% to 2/3 of the population of Europe. I mean, it was devastating in numbers. 50% to 2/3 of the population of Europe. And once again, when people began noticing the plague, when they began noticing people dying, people did what? They turned to the Roman Catholic Church and said, what do we do? You know everything. God speaks to you. At least you tell us that God speaks to you. What do we do? And of course, the church was very imaginative with the answers they came up. They first said, this plague is caused by your sin. Stop sinning. Stop doing things that are sinful, including having sex. Wait, no. And then when that didn't work, people kept dying. The church said, I know. Cats. Cats, the devil is always accompanied by cats. Everybody knows that cats are Satan's pet. Kill all the cats. It was called the Great Cat Massacre. In fact, there's a book. I have a book titled The Great Cat Massacre. The problem was cats were one of the few predators mice and rats had, and so that really didn't help either. Then they did all sorts of things like bleeding people, cutting people to make them bleed, or drinking urine, there was an idea that if you danced Dance. If you danced all the time, the plague wouldn't get you. And since flowers represented the freshness, the vitality of life, if you stuffed your pockets with flowers, it would ward off the plague. Ring around the rosies, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes. Yeah. And so, and you know what? You know what? It did not work. None of it worked. None of it worked till the plague had run its course. But once again, we see something that came and went, and the Roman Catholic Church, having long claimed to be everybody's answer and knowing, having the path to God. I mean, if God's all powerful and the church has its ear, then they should be able to know something and do something about this plague. Pardon me. Another chink in the armor. Another thing that gave rise to a suspicion that said maybe the church does not have all the answers. Now, so the plague came and went in those 12, 14 months, leaving about 50% of the population of Europe still alive. I mean, it's kind of interesting, though. Actually, in some parts of Europe, the deaths were worse. And on the other hand, if a city was off the beaten path, if it was away from the trade routes, the city would be untouched. Actually, the most effective treatment that people came up with the plague was walling up their houses with the people inside and setting the house on fire, which they did. Anyway, here's one more thing to remember about the plague, though, was this, and this is important. You should make note of it. So the plague kills from between 50% to 2/3 of the population, leaving 50% to 1/3 of the population left. Actually, that was a good thing for those who survived. It meant that, for one thing, there was more food for everybody, which was a thing. Yeah, I mean, the population was just chopped down, but they could still produce the same amount of food, and so there was more plentiful food for everybody. It also meant that for the few people left, they could actually demand better wages. And so the population of Europe went down here, food supply was up here, and that situation will take probably about 3 to 5 centuries to rectify again. Fact of the matter is, it is not until the 18th century when you begin to hear that in Europe, starvation is a problem again. Basically, what happens is that the population of Europe, after having been chopped down by the plague, gets leveled with their ability to make food. Okay. Pardon me. All right, let's talk about part E there. 3 instances. Now, I'm going to give me about 5 more minutes, guys. 3 instances that brought about the modern era. These are so critical. 3 dates, 3 occurrences, 3 things that ushered in, that brought Europe from the Middle Ages, from the Dark Ages, into the modern era, the modern age. And they all happened in Europe. And what's odd about all 3 of them, when they occurred, most people didn't give them a whole lot of thought. 3 dates. Here they are. 1453. In 1453, the city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was finally surrounded and cut off by the forces of the Ottoman Turks, led by Mehmet Osman, Mehmet II, Mehmet the Conqueror, who finally surrounded the city. And by the time this happened, the city of Constantinople, the great capital, was defended by about 8,000, mostly mercenary soldiers, paid soldiers, including the Emperor of Constantinople, Constantine the 11th, who by this time was just barely more than a boy, who died in the defense of the city. Mehmet II had surrounded the city on all sides, including he hauled 70 ships from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara, so he could have ships on both sides of the city bombarding the city. And the city fell. Now, why is that so important? Well, in the years prior to the fall of Constantinople, a lot of the scholars who had still libraries full of the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans, full of the ancient wisdom, text, and all those things. A lot of them decided that since this city was going to fall to Muslims, that maybe they should leave. And so they packed their bags in the years preceding 1453 and packed all those documents, all those learning and things, and headed to the only place that was still safe for Christians, and that was Italy in Western Europe. And they took that knowledge with them. And that, and you say, well, didn't the Roman Catholic Church already have that? Well, you got to remember that during much of the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church had committed itself to destroying anything the Greeks or Romans had written. Anything. Because the Roman Catholic Church felt that the Greeks and Romans, since they were pagans, that anything they had written down must be pagan as well, and therefore they burned it. But in 1453, all this stuff was brought back, and it was embraced again. It was a reflowering of knowledge. 1456. 1456 is, once again, it was something where nobody thought much about it when it happened. There was a businessman, a printer in Germany by the name of Johann Gutenberg. Johann Gutenberg did not invent the first printing press. There were lots of printing presses before Gutenberg. But what Gutenberg did, he came up with a single innovation. Gutenberg's printing press was called a movable type printing press. That meant that he could interchange the letters on a page. And that meant, because before, to make a page of print, here's your page, put the letters here, they had to carve it into the wood. Well, these wooden blocks, after you used them a few times to make a page, they would splinter. Metal, that would mean that every time you had a different page, you would have to either carve new letters into the metal or remold it or whatever. In other words, it's a big hassle. But, Gutenberg came up with the idea of just creating little tiny block squares of the letters. And whenever he wanted to change a page, he would just arrange the different letters. Now, what that does, and of course, I'm sure you know, the first thing Gutenberg ever printed was a Bible, right? But what that does, and this is why it's so important, this is why the printing press is huge, was because the printing press, very quick, made knowledge cheap. Not right away. In fact, for the next 200 years, most people in Europe not only will not own a book, but probably never see a book. But books became more and more in print. They were cheaper. And made knowledge cheap. So more people could read about what other people thought. More people could benefit from it. There's this wonderful A&E special that they recorded right around at the turn of the millennium, the year 2000. And in this series, A&E ranked the top 100 individuals of the last 1,000 years. Anybody who lived from the year 1000 to the year 2000, they ranked them in their importance of contributions to the planet. Number one, Johann Gutenberg, because of the printing press. The printing press made knowledge cheap. It meant that people could read the works and thoughts of others and then make their own works and thoughts on top of that, etc., etc., etc. The printing press enabled Martin Luther, for example, not to be burned at the stake, like a guy named Jan Hus was 100 years later for saying the same thing. Because Martin Luther, because he printed his materials, it got out there, and he got developed a following. And so, yeah. And finally, 1492. Do I need to? Yeah, right. Now, Christopher Columbus has long since been criticized and lionized because of that, and probably deserves to be, because he himself was not a kind man to the Native Americans he encountered. Not at all. He, like many Europeans, thought the Native Americans were savages and treated them like savages, even though the Native Americans, when they first encountered Columbus, were actually pretty decent to him. But when Columbus tripped over, and that's what he did, he tripped over. He was going to India. He found the Western Hemisphere by mistake. But when he tripped over the Western Hemisphere, and by the way, Columbus made 4 voyages. He never knew that he had found a new world. He died not knowing he had found a new world. But when he did, it encouraged people to come. And in doing so, opened a floodgate of products coming from the New World into Europe. Of course, yeah, gold and silver. The Spanish will start hauling silver to Spain by the ton. Gold, a lot of gold too, but silver by the ton. But it was more about the agricultural products. For example, corn. Corn, you can get 40 times the calories. Potatoes. You can get 40 times the calories from an acre of potatoes than you can an acre of wheat, which had been the staple crop in Europe. And corn, same thing. The corn was tremendous nutrient asset to the Europeans. And so, yeah. But anyway, Christopher Columbus opened that door. And that is why. Basically, and write this down, the years 1492 to 1914. 1914, do you remember what happened there? Those years are called the Age of Europe and it's because of Columbus. Columbus opened this door for tremendous wealth to be passed on to Europe, and the Europeans paid a fraction of its cost. Europe became very rich because they were sucking resources out of the New World, as well as other parts of the world. And Christopher Columbus was the father of that. But yeah, those 3 things. And finally, the last thing for today, what is important about modern European history? It's basically what I just said. Why do we study modern European history? Why is it a course? Why don't we study Chinese history? Why don't we study Southeast Asian history? Why don't we study the history of South Africa or anything like that? Why don't we study European history? Well, because European history has been the dominant culture of this planet from basically 1492 to 1914. It's still a player. Do you like that word? Yeah, how did Europe rise to this place, and how did they lose that place? And that's why it's important. And I know today's lecture was long. I hope that you stayed with me. But yeah, we need to make time anyway. I'm going to sign off. You are finished. If you have questions, ask me on Tuesday. I'm going to go now and begin my weekend. Okay? Bye, guys.